At 1:23:58 in the morning on April 26, 1986, a steel and concrete lid weighing 1,000 tons was thrown into the air like a coin. It had been sealing a nuclear reactor. In the seconds that followed, the core of Reactor 4 at the Chernobyl power plant lay open to the night sky, burning and throwing radioactive dust higher than a passenger jet flies. Near the ruined core, radiation levels reached an estimated 20,000 roentgens per hour. A dose of about 400 roentgens spread over a few hours is enough to kill a human being, which means that in certain spots around the wreck, a firefighter standing still would absorb a lethal dose in under 2 minutes. Many of them stood there for hours. This is the story of why. The Vladimir Ilyich Lenin nuclear power plant sat in northern Ukraine, near the border with Belarus, about 100 kilometers from Kyiv. Its 4 RBMK 1000 reactors were a showcase of Soviet engineering, feeding roughly a tenth of Ukraine's electricity into the grid. 2 more reactors were under construction. Chernobyl wasn't just a power station. It was proof in concrete and steel that the Soviet Union could master the atom. 3 kilometers away stood Pripyat, a purpose-built city of 49,000 people. The average age was just 26. It had swimming pools, a cinema, 16-story apartment towers, and a brand-new amusement park with a yellow Ferris wheel, scheduled to open on the 1st of May. Pripyat was young, modern, and proud. It had less than 30 hours left. That April, engineers at Reactor 4 were preparing a safety test. The question sounded simple. If the plant ever lost outside power, the cooling pumps would stop, and a reactor must never, ever stop being cooled. Backup diesel generators took about 45 seconds to reach full power. The test would check whether the spinning turbine, coasting down like a flywheel, could bridge that gap. The test had already failed 3 times before. On April 25, the operators began lowering the reactor's power for the test. Then the grid controller in Kyiv called. A power station elsewhere had gone offline and Chernobyl's electricity was needed. The test was postponed. For around 10 hours, Reactor 4 was held at half power, and inside its core, invisibly, something was building up. A poison made by the reactor itself. That poison was a gas called xenon 135. It's a natural byproduct of nuclear fission, and it has one crucial property. It soaks up neutrons, the tiny particles that keep a nuclear chain reaction alive. Think of xenon as a sponge inside the engine, absorbing the very sparks the reactor runs on. At full power, the reactor burns the sponge away as fast as it forms. At half power, the sponge grows. Just after midnight, the night shift took over. In the control room stood Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov, Shift Supervisor Alexander Akimov, and Leonid Toptunov, the 25-year-old operator at the reactor controls. As they lowered power further for the test, Toptunov made a switch between control systems, and the poisoned reactor collapsed. Power crashed from over 700 megawatts to barely 30. The reactor was nearly stalled. By every sensible rule, the test should have been abandoned. Instead, Dyatlov ordered power raised. To do it, operators pulled control rods out of the core, the movable brakes of the reactor. Of 211 rods, they withdrew far more than regulations ever allowed until the reactor was running with almost no brakes left. They clawed power back to 200 megawatts. The test procedure required at least 700. They decided to run it anyway. To understand what happened next, you have to understand the machine itself. Inside an RBMK reactor, uranium fuel splits apart, atom by atom, releasing heat. Water flows past the fuel and boils. The steam spins turbines. The turbines make electricity. In a sense, a nuclear plant is just a colossal kettle. But this kettle held 1,661 fuel channels, and its fire was a chain reaction. A chain reaction needs one more ingredient, something to slow the neutrons down so they can split more atoms. That's called a moderator. In the RBMK, the moderator was 1,700 tons of graphite, the same material as pencil lead, stacked in blocks around the fuel. The water flowing through was only there to cool, and that split of jobs, graphite to sustain the reaction, water to cool it, hit a monster. Here's the monster. Water doesn't just cool an RBMK, it also absorbs some neutrons, gently holding the reaction back. Steam absorbs almost none. So when the water boils and bubbles form, the reaction loses a break, power rises. More power boils more water, which makes more bubbles, which raises power again. Engineers call it a positive void coefficient. In plain language, this reactor, under the wrong conditions, could press its own accelerator. Most reactors in the West use water as both coolant and moderator. If that water boils away, the chain reaction chokes and dies. The design fails safe. The RBMK failed dangerous. Soviet physicists knew about this flaw. A partial power surge at the Ignalina plant in 1983 had even revealed a second flaw in the control rods themselves. The information was filed away, classified, and never turned into a warning the operators would see. That second flaw was almost absurd. The RBMK control rods were tipped with graphite, the neutron-friendly material, with the neutron-absorbing boron above it. When a fully withdrawn rod was inserted, the first thing entering the bottom of the core wasn't a break at all. It was graphite, displacing water and briefly boosting the reaction there. Pressing the emergency stop in exactly the wrong state would first stamp on the accelerator. At 1:23:04 a.m. the test began. Steam to the turbine was cut and the turbine began to coast. The main cooling pumps powered by that dying turbine slowed. Less water flowed through the core. The water grew hotter and boiled harder. Bubbles multiplied in the fuel channels. Deep inside the reactor, the monster woke. Power began to creep upward, then to climb. At 1:23:40, Akimov pressed the emergency shutdown button, known as AZ5. All the control rods began to drive into the core at a crawl of 40 centimeters per second, needing roughly 18 seconds to fully insert. And because so many rods had been pulled all the way out, dozens of graphite tips entered the hottest part of the core at the same moment. The power spike began. In roughly 4 seconds, according to later reconstructions, power leapt from 200 megawatts to an estimated 30,000 or more, 10 times what the reactor was built to survive. Fuel pellets shattered, channels ruptured, the rods jammed partway in. Water hitting white-hot fuel flashed instantly to steam, and pressure spiked beyond anything the vessel could hold. At 1:23:58, the steam blast heaved the 1,000-ton upper shield. Workers had nicknamed it Alina, clean off the reactor. 2 or 3 seconds later came a second, even larger explosion, likely hydrogen or a surge of runaway fission. Scientists still debate its exact nature. Around 50 tons of fuel and graphite were hurled out. Chunks of the reactor's own core landed, glowing on the roofs and asphalt below. The graphite caught fire. Within minutes, firefighters from the plant and from Pripyat were rolling toward the blaze, Lieutenant Volodymyr Pravik's brigade among the first, at about 1:28 a.m. No one told them the core was open. Their dosimeters couldn't read levels remotely this high. Men climbed onto roofs strewn with reactor graphite, kicked it aside in their boots, and aimed hoses at a fire that water could not put out. Some described a strange metallic taste, and skin that tingled like sunburn. Inside the shattered control room, Dyatlov refused to believe the core was gone, and RBMK, he insisted, could not explode. Akimov and Toptunov spent the night opening valves by hand, pumping water toward a reactor that no longer existed, wading through radioactive water to do it. Both died of radiation sickness within weeks. 2 workers were killed that night. 28 more firefighters and operators would die of acute radiation syndrome in the following months. Morning came and Pripyat simply woke up. Children walked to school. Couples were photographed at weddings. Families fished in the cooling pond within sight of the smoking reactor. The plant's available dosimeters maxed out at readings absurdly below reality, and officials reported the numbers the instruments showed, not the truth. Moscow said nothing. For 36 hours, a city of 49,000 lived beside an open reactor core. At 2 p.m. on April 27, a column of 1,100 buses rolled into Pripyat. Residents were told to bring documents and food for 3 days. They left dinner on tables, dolls on beds, gas masks in school cupboards. Within 3 hours, the city was empty. No one ever moved back. Eventually, around 350,000 people would be resettled from the contaminated lands of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. The world found out from a pair of shoes. On the morning of April 28, at the Forsmark nuclear plant in Sweden, more than 1,000 kilometers away, a worker's footwear set off radiation alarms. The contamination hadn't come from Forsmark. It had come on the wind. Only that evening did Soviet television read a statement, about 20 seconds long, admitting an accident had occurred at Chernobyl. The battle to smother the core was fought from the air. Helicopter crews flew directly through the radioactive plume, dropping around 5,000 tons of sand, clay, boron, and lead into the glowing crater. Beneath the reactor, coal miners from Chila and Donbas dug a tunnel by hand in brutal heat to protect the ground below from a possible melt-through. Above, on the roof of the neighboring unit, radiation was so fierce that electronic robots failed, so they sent men. They called them bio-robots, soldiers in lead aprons, shoveling reactor graphite off the roof in shifts of about 90 seconds each, a lifetime's dose in the time it takes to tie your shoes. In total, an estimated 600,000 people, soldiers, miners, drivers, engineers, nurses, served as liquidators, cleaning up the disaster. By December 1986, just 206 days after the explosion, they had buried Reactor 4 inside a vast concrete and steel shell, the sarcophagus. Deep in the basement beneath the ruin, the melted core had flowed like lava and frozen into black masses of fuel, sand, and steel. The most infamous, shaped like a wrinkled tree stump, was named the Elephant's Foot. In 1986, it emitted an estimated 10,000 roentgens per hour. Minutes in its presence meant death. It sits there still, slowly cooling, one of the most dangerous objects human beings have ever created. So what did Chernobyl cost? Officially, 31 people died in the explosion and its immediate aftermath. But the true toll is counted in decades. The World Health Organization has estimated around 4,000 eventual deaths among the most exposed populations. Other studies argue for higher numbers, and the debate continues. What's certain, thousands of thyroid cancer cases, mostly in children who drank contaminated milk, the great majority, thankfully, treated successfully. The lessons reached further than medicine. The RBMK flaws were finally fixed across the Soviet fleet: faster rods, no graphite tips doing the devil's work, more absorbers in the core. Valery Legasov, the chemist who led the scientific response and told uncomfortable truths about the design, took his own life in 1988. His recorded memoirs helped force the full story out. Mikhail Gorbachev later said Chernobyl was, perhaps more than anything else, the turning point that helped bring down the Soviet Union. In 2016, a gleaming steel arch, the new safe confinement, 36,000 tons, taller than the Statue of Liberty, the largest movable structure ever built, was slid on rails over the crumbling sarcophagus, sealing Reactor 4 for the next 100 years. Around it, the exclusion zone has gone quiet and strangely wild. Wolves, lynx, and herds of horses roam streets where children once cycled to school. Reactor 4 did not explode because nuclear power is unmasterable, or because one operator pressed the wrong button. It exploded because a known flaw was stamped secret, because a test outranked the rules, and because everyone in the chain assumed the machine was safer than it was. The atom did exactly what physics said it would. It was the silence around it that detonated, and the fallout from a hidden truth can circle the entire world.